I still remember the sound of the hospital monitor before I remember her voice. Slow, steady, lonely. It was the kind of sound that forces a grandmother to notice every silence in the room. My granddaughter Emma had always filled silence with warmth. Even as a little girl, she hummed while doing homework, talked to flowers while watering them, and laughed at her own jokes before anyone else could. But that afternoon, at 26 years old, she stared at the ceiling like someone had quietly removed all the color from her life. The late winter rain tapped softly against the hospital window. I sat beside her bed with a paper cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, pretending not to notice how pale she looked. "You should rest," I whispered. She nodded, but her eyes stayed open. There are moments when you realize someone is carrying pain too heavy for their age. I saw it then. Not physical pain. Not the illness that had brought her there after weeks of exhaustion and stress. Something deeper, something hidden. Emma slowly reached beneath her pillow and pulled out a wrinkled envelope. Her fingers trembled as she held it toward me. "I didn't know who else to tell," she said quietly. I took the envelope carefully. My name was written across the front in her familiar handwriting. For a second I smiled. Then I opened it. Inside were copies of bank transfers, property documents, and one printed photograph of a black luxury car sitting proudly in my son Daniel's driveway. A red ribbon stretched across the hood like it was some kind of celebration. At the bottom of the page was a number, $115,000. My stomach tightened. That number was impossible to mistake. It was the inheritance I had left Emma 3 years earlier after selling the small lake house my late husband and I had owned for decades. I had set the money aside carefully, quietly, intentionally. It was supposed to help her build a peaceful future someday. A home, a business, security, freedom, something stable, something hers. I looked back at Emma confused. "Sweetheart, why do you have these?" Her lips parted, but no words came at first. Only tears gathering slowly in the corners of her eyes, as if even crying required energy she no longer had. "They said you changed your mind," she whispered. "Mom said you wanted Ethan to have help instead." Ethan. Her older brother, the golden child without meaning to be cruel. The boy everyone rescued before he learned how to stand on his own. New apartment, paid debts, endless second chances. I swallowed hard. "I never said that." Emma looked down at the blanket covering her hands. "I figured that out too late." The room became unbearably quiet. I felt something inside me shift. Not anger yet, but grief. The kind that arrives when trust breaks so softly you almost miss the sound of it. I thought about every family dinner where nobody mentioned money. Every time Daniel changed the subject when I asked about Emma's future plans. Every polite smile from my daughter-in-law. Every silence I had mistaken for peace. How long had this secret been living inside my family? Emma wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed by them. "I wasn't going to tell you," she admitted. "I didn't want you to feel guilty." That sentence hurt more than anything else, because while she protected my feelings, nobody had protected hers. I reached for her hand and held it carefully, the same way I had held it when she was 5 years old and afraid of thunderstorms. "You should have come to me sooner," I whispered. She gave me a tired smile. I think part of me still hoped they'd tell the truth themselves. Outside, rain slid down the glass in long silver lines, and for the first time in my life, I realized love inside a family could exist beside dishonesty so quietly that you might not see it until someone gentle finally breaks beneath it. 2 days after Emma showed me the envelope, I drove to my son's house alone. The rain had stopped, but the sky still carried that heavy gray color that makes everything feel unfinished. I parked slowly across the street and sat there for a moment with both hands resting on the steering wheel. Then I saw it. The car. Black. Shining. Untouched. It sat in the driveway like a trophy. A ridiculous red ribbon still hung loosely from one mirror, damp from the weather. Someone had celebrated that purchase. Someone had smiled beside it, taken photographs, posted them somewhere online, probably with words like "blessed and hard work pays off." And all I could think about was Emma lying in a hospital bed, apologizing for telling me the truth. I stayed in the car longer than I expected to. Not because I was afraid of confrontation. I was 72 years old. Life had already shown me harder things than disappointment. But betrayal from strangers arrives cleanly. Betrayal from your own children arrives mixed with memories. I kept seeing Daniel at 10 years old, running toward me after baseball practice. Daniel at 16, nervous before his driving test. Daniel crying at his father's funeral, holding my hand so tightly I thought grief might break us both. Love does not disappear when trust does. That is what makes family pain so confusing. When I finally walked to the front door, my chest felt strangely calm. Daniel opened it with surprise written all over his face. "Mom, you should have called." "I was nearby," I lied gently. Behind him, I could hear laughter from the kitchen. My daughter-in-law, Rebecca, appeared holding a wine glass, smiling too quickly when she saw me. "Linda, what a nice surprise." People become overly kind when they are hiding something. I noticed that immediately. The house smelled like expensive candles and fresh coffee. Ethan came downstairs a few seconds later, car keys spinning around his finger. "There she is," he grinned. "Want to see the new car?" The room went silent after he said it. Not dramatic silence. Worse. The careful kind. The kind where everyone suddenly watches each other without moving. I looked at my grandson for a long moment. Ethan wasn't cruel. That was the hardest part. Spoiled, yes. Thoughtless, maybe, but not malicious. I wondered if he even knew where the money had truly come from. "It's very beautiful," I said quietly. Rebecca set her wine glass down too carefully. Daniel crossed his arms. "Mom, I visited Emma yesterday." That was all I said, but it changed the air in the room instantly. Ethan stopped spinning the keys. Rebecca looked at Daniel instead of me. And my son looked tired. Not guilty at first, just tired. As though carrying a lie for too long had finally become heavy. "She shouldn't have upset you while you're worrying about her health," Rebecca said softly. I turned toward her. "Did you tell her I gave away her inheritance willingly?" Nobody answered. Sometimes silence confesses faster than words. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "Mom, we intended to replace the money." "When?" His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. That answer was enough. I nodded slowly, feeling something inside me settle into place. Not rage, not revenge, clarity. The kind that arrives after you stop making excuses for people because you love them. "I trusted you," I said. Daniel looked down immediately. And suddenly I saw it. Not arrogance, not cruelty. Weakness. Small decisions repeated over time until dishonesty became easier than honesty. Rebecca spoke carefully. "Ethan needed help getting established. So did Emma." The softness in my voice seemed to hurt more than shouting would have. Nobody spoke after that. Through the front window, I could still see the black car shining in the driveway. Beautiful, expensive, empty. And standing there in my son's warm kitchen, I realized the car itself was never the real betrayal. It was the quiet agreement they had all made together, the decision that Emma would understand, the assumption that she would stay silent, the belief that my trust belonged to them no matter what they did with it. I picked up my coat calmly. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice suddenly fragile. "Please don't do this." But he still didn't know what this was. Neither did I. Not yet. I only knew one thing for certain. The woman who walked out of that house was not the same woman who had walked in. The hospital hallway smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee. It was nearly midnight when I stepped out of Emma's room, pulling the door shut quietly behind me. She had finally fallen asleep after hours of pretending she wasn't exhausted. Even resting, she looked tense, as though her body had forgotten how to feel safe. I stood there for a moment watching her through the small glass window in the door. My granddaughter had spent months carrying betrayal alone. That realization settled heavily into my chest. Families like ours never shouted. We never slammed doors or threw cruel words across dinner tables. We specialized in softer damage. Avoidance, excuses, smiles that covered selfishness. Silence that slowly taught one person their feelings mattered less than everyone else's comfort. And somehow Emma had become that person. I walked slowly down the hallway until I found an empty waiting area near the elevators. A television played muted news in the corner while an elderly man slept upright in a plastic chair. Everything felt strangely still. For the first time in days, I allowed myself to cry. Not loudly, just enough to release the ache sitting behind my ribs. I cried for Emma. For the years she spent trying not to burden anyone. For every moment she probably questioned her own worth because the people closest to her treated her patience like permission. And I cried for myself too. Because mothers carry a private grief when their children grow into people they no longer recognize. After a while, I wiped my face carefully and reached into my purse for my phone. There was one number I had not called in nearly 6 years. Harold Bennett. My late husband's lawyer, but more than that, he had been our friend. Calm, precise, impossible to intimidate. The kind of man who listened longer than most people talked. My finger hovered over his name before I pressed it. He answered on the third ring. "Linda?" His voice sounded older now, softer. "I'm sorry to call this late." "You never have to apologize to me," he said gently. "Is everything all right?" I looked down the empty hallway. No, I admitted. I think I made a terrible mistake with my family. There was a pause. Not impatient, not uncomfortable, just patient enough to let me continue when I was ready. So I told him everything. Not dramatically, not angrily. I simply laid the truth down piece by piece. The inheritance, the lies, the car, Emma's silence, my son's excuses. When I finished speaking, Harold sighed quietly. I wondered if something like this might happen someday, he said carefully. That sentence caught me off guard. What do you mean? Your husband worried about unequal loyalties in the family after Ethan started receiving financial help repeatedly. I closed my eyes. Even Richard had seen it. Years ago, before he died. He made very specific recommendations when we structured your estate plans, Harold continued. Recommendations you chose not to formalize because you trusted your children to do the right thing. Trust. There it was again. That beautiful, dangerous thing. I thought love would make them fair, I whispered. And now? I looked through the nearby window into the dark parking lot below. Now I think love without boundaries can make people careless. The silence after that felt important, not empty, transforming. Harold finally spoke again, his tone steady and kind. Linda, you still have options, quiet ones, respectful ones. But you need to stop protecting everyone from the consequences of their own choices. Those words settled deep inside me. Because he was right. For years I had confused kindness with self-erasure. I had softened truths to keep peace alive inside the family. I had accepted discomfort quietly so others could remain comfortable loudly. And Emma had learned to do the same. That was the inheritance I truly feared passing down. Not money, silence. I straightened slowly in my chair and took a long breath. Then I said the sentence that changed everything. I think it's time you met my granddaughter. Harold's voice warmed immediately. I'd be honored. When the call ended, I remained seated for a while, listening to the distant sounds of nurses moving through the halls. Something inside me felt different now, not hardened, clear. I could not undo the betrayal. I could not force honesty into people who chose convenience instead. But I could stop pretending love required endless forgiveness without accountability. I stood and looked back toward Emma's room. For the first time since opening that envelope beneath her pillow, I no longer felt helpless. Quiet grief had slowly become quiet strength. And sometimes, that is how dignity begins. 3 months later, the car was gone. I did not ask what happened to it. Daniel never volunteered the details either. But families reveal their fractures in small ways long before they speak them aloud. Ethan stopped posting photographs online. Rebecca's cheerful phone calls disappeared. And my son's voice changed whenever he called me. Careful now, uncertain, as though he had finally realized trust was not permanent, simply because someone loved you. I never screamed at them. That surprised them most of all. People prepare themselves for anger. They know how to defend against shouting. But quiet boundaries force people to sit alone with their own reflection. That is much harder. Emma had returned home by then. Her health slowly improved once stress stopped living inside her body every day. Some afternoons she came to my house and sat beside me on the back porch while we watched birds gather near the garden. At first, she apologized constantly for telling me the truth, for causing problems, for splitting the family apart. Every time she said those things, my heart ached. One evening, while the sun faded gold across the yard, I finally took her hand gently and said, "Sweetheart, honesty did not break this family. Dishonesty did," she cried after that. Not dramatic tears, quiet ones, the kind that arrive when someone finally stops blaming themselves for surviving disappointment. Harold helped me restructure everything carefully, legally, calmly, transparently. No revenge, no punishment, just clarity. The remaining assets in my estate were placed into protected arrangements that could not be manipulated, borrowed, redirected, or emotionally negotiated later. Emma would receive what was intended for her directly, securely, and privately. And for the first time in years, I slept peacefully. Not because justice feels good, but because uncertainty no longer lived in my home. Daniel came to see me one Sunday afternoon in early spring. He looked older somehow. Regret does that to people. We sat at the kitchen table where I had once packed his school lunches as a boy. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then he said quietly, "I keep trying to understand why I let it happen." I stirred my tea slowly before answering. Because little compromises become habits. His eyes filled immediately. I never meant to hurt Emma. I know. And I did know. That was the tragedy of it all. Most family betrayals are not born from hatred. They grow from entitlement, avoidance, favoritism, and the dangerous assumption that forgiving people will continue forgiving forever. Daniel lowered his head into his hands. I thought I had more time to fix it. There it was. The sentence people speak when consequences finally arrive before excuses are ready. I reached across the table and touched his wrist gently. You still have time to become honest. He cried then, not loudly, just enough to sound human again. I did not rescue him from those tears. Some pain deserves to be felt fully. Before leaving, he paused at the front door. Do you think Emma will ever forgive me? I looked at my son for a long moment. Forgiveness is not the same as trust, I said softly. One can return long before the other. After he left, I stood alone in the quiet house listening to the clock tick in the hallway. And strangely, I felt peaceful. Not victorious, peaceful. Because I finally understood something age had been trying to teach me for years. Real love does not require you to abandon yourself. It does not ask you to stay silent so others can stay comfortable. It does not demand endless understanding from the person carrying the deepest hurt. Healthy love needs truth, boundaries, respect. That was the inheritance my family almost lost. Not the money, the lesson. A few days later, Emma helped me plant white roses along the fence behind the house. The soil was cool beneath our hands, and the wind carried the smell of spring through the yard. At one point, she smiled at me softly and said, "Grandma, I think I'm finally starting to feel safe again." I looked at her then, really looked at her, and I realized something beautiful. They had taken the money, but they had not taken her gentleness. They had not taken her future, and they had not taken the quiet strength growing now inside both of us.